I came across this tweet this morning, and it got me thinking. The video attached to it is nothing special, just a young Labour MP in the UK ranting about how much she has to pay for her student loans and how unfair it all is. But it's the caption that caught my eye. Students shouldn't have to pay tuition fees this year, or next year, or any year. That's because education is a right, not a commodity. I wonder how this Miss Sultana can possibly think this, you know? I mean, a commodity is a raw material or primary agricultural product that can be bought and sold, like copper or coffee. And yeah, fair enough, education isn't a physical product like that. But maybe she's using the other definition of commodity, which is basically just something valuable. Insofar as education is valuable, it's certainly a commodity. But no, what I think she's getting at by using the word commodity here is the idea that a thing is bought and sold, it is exchangeable on a market. That is the colloquial definition of commodity. Not just all manner of physical goods, but real property like land or buildings, our labor, our time, even our speech, options to exercise certain rights over other property. Almost everything can be bought and sold, making almost everything a colloquial commodity. But some things cannot be bought and sold. For example, I can't sell myself into slavery. The laws of my country won't let me do that. I can't sell the option to murder me to somebody else. Like if you pay me money for the exclusive right to kill me, you're still going to be considered a murderer and locked away by the cops. When Miss Sultana compares rights to commodities in her statement, she's pointing out that our society has created a class of things that cannot be bought and sold at any price, even if the buyers and sellers consent, because these things are inalienable rights. I have a right to life, which means the right to not be murdered, and I can't exchange that right for money. I can't make it legal to murder me, even if I consent and get a fat bag. Understanding this, what Miss Sultana is saying, it's just blatantly false, isn't it? She says education is a right, not a commodity. Well, is education a right? Is that a true statement? Let's break it down rationally. When something is a right, that means you have exclusive access to it. Other people have either a responsibility to provide it for you, or a responsibility to not prevent you from providing it to yourself. When I say I have a right to free speech, what that means in practical terms is that other people have a responsibility to not censor my speech. Preventing me from speaking is violating my rights. So, a basic colloquial definition of a right is something that I have the ability to do that doesn't infringe on anyone else. So, when Miss Sultana is in Parliament in the video waving around her student loans, she's clearly got a debt that needs to be paid. And when she says in her tweet, education is a right, not a commodity, what she's actually saying is, I have the right to a free education. I have the right to be educated and not have to pay for it. But that's false. She does not have that right. Those debt papers in her hands prove it. Well, okay, maybe when she says education is a right, what she means is education should be a right. This interpretation of this type of statement is, I think, pretty common. For example, how many times have you seen Americans hold up signs saying healthcare is a human right? The answer to that, by the way, is you've seen them many times, since I've done a previous video on them. However, when these people say healthcare is a human right, what they mean is healthcare should be a human right. So why do they say is a right and not should be a right? Should be is clearly more accurate than is, but they go with is nearly every time. Look at the LGBTQ protests, for example. They say love is a human right, or marriage is a human right. But that's even more inaccurate. Nobody has the right to just be loved by anybody else, gay or straight. We all want to be loved, but you can't compel somebody to do it. These might all be common slogans that have caught on, but they're very inaccurate. Okay, it's time to stop being so colloquial about this conversation. The formal definition of a right is the fundamental normative rules about what is allowed of people or owed to people according to some legal system, social convention, or ethical theory. Rights are broken down into two types: natural rights and civil rights. A natural right is what all people can do in a vacuum. Oftentimes, the thought experiment invoked to describe natural rights is the Robinson Crusoe island economy, where if you were shipwrecked on an island, all the things you can do for yourself are what your rights are. You have the right to hunt and fish and forage, the right to build shelter or clothing, the right to defend what's yours. But you don't have the right to be rescued or to be provided for. In essence, you have the right to your own labor and its produce, but not to anybody else. You have the right to not be interfered with by others, but you don't have the right to compel others to interfere with you. By the way, when I spoke about the flaws of liberalism in a previous video, where the classical liberals began to construct their philosophy of how a government should be organized, beginning with man in the state of nature, that is this, the set of natural rights, the Robinson Crusoe island. A civil right, to contrast, is what other people provide for you, generally in the form of a government. The right to vote, the right to legal counsel or a fair trial, the right to not incriminate yourself. These things are not natural rights, because voting, trials, and the like don't exist in nature. They don't exist on Robinson Crusoe's island. However, they are an inevitable consequence of the natural rights of many different individuals overlapping as we live together in a group. Here's an example of what I mean. As per the whole man in a state of nature thing, I have the right to build myself a shelter. If you steal my shelter, you've stolen my labor without my consent. You've violated my right. You've infringed into my isolated island economy. But maybe you didn't know it was my shelter. You just started taking something you thought was abandoned and returned to nature, which, by the way, is possible. That's also a part of natural right theory too, as I described in my squatter video. So who is the judge who's correct here? We're both subjective parts of this conflict, so we need an outsider to look at the situation objectively. We both have natural free speech rights, and we both have arguments to make. So there should be some basic process by which the outsider can hear each of us out and look over the evidence, etc., etc. You can see how a rudimentary investigative and justice system arises pretty quickly to mediate areas where the edges between two people's natural rights are kind of fuzzy and blend together. That is what civil rights are. They're a logical extension of people's natural rights when those rights overlap as a consequence of living together in a society. Libertarians often characterize these two sets of rights as positive rights versus negative rights. The natural rights are negative, in that they are the things you can do in a vacuum. Nobody is compelled by any other agent to do them. The civil rights are the positive ones, in that they are things you must do so that another person's rights are not violated. Failure to do them automatically means violating somebody else's rights, so an authority has the jurisdiction to compel you to do them, whether you want to or not. Put simply, positive rights oblige others to act, while negative rights oblige others not to act. However, this isn't the only difference between natural and civil rights. Since natural rights are based on what you can do in a vacuum, that means they're dependent on your biology. On Crusoe's island, you have the right to run, but only if you're capable of doing so. If you were born without legs, the island isn't going to give you your legs back and let you run, unless you're on the island from Lost or something. Your natural rights are based on and limited by the limits of your natural self. Civil rights, meanwhile, are granted by other people in the form of governments. What this means is, those people, those governments, determine what the civil rights are, and this is where the conversation gets tricky. Consider the Uyghur population in China. A common refrain in the West is that China is violating the human rights of the Uyghurs. And you know what? Colloquially, I completely agree. They're being rounded up in re-education centers, their women are being forcibly married to Han Chinese men, their men are being beaten, starved, killed. All these are terrible things. But when people say China is violating the human rights of the Uyghurs, what rights do they refer to when they say human rights? Do they mean civil rights? Well, surely not. As we've already discussed, civil rights are granted by governments. Governments determine what civil rights are. Definitionally, governments cannot violate civil rights, as they are the source of those rights. If the Chinese government has decided that the Uyghurs don't have civil rights, then the civil rights of the Uyghurs aren't being violated. They would have to exist first to be violated, and they don't exist. The government has the final say. So that only leaves natural rights. If China is violating the rights of the Uyghurs, it has to be the natural rights they're violating, since natural rights exist independently from governments. And by the way, all liberal governments understand this. For example, the reason the American Constitution begins with the idea that all men are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights is because the founders were specifically referring to natural rights here. The rights are described as inalienable specifically because the Constitution is not a document that creates and grants rights to the people, civil rights. It's a document that secures and protects the rights that people already have, the natural rights. That's why the creator is mentioned. The original liberals believed that natural rights stemmed from God's authority, not man's, and that man could not override what God has granted, only respect it. Other liberal countries have similar declarations in their constitutions, because this is a foundational part of liberal political philosophy. The idea that there is a set of rights that exists outside of the bounds of the government, that we all have access to by virtue of being human, whether that's due to God or nature, or our capacity for rational thought, that is what natural rights are. And civil rights come about when a government that tries to respect natural rights has to deal with the messy, real-world implications of respecting all of them, even when they conflict. Natural rights exist before government. Civil rights are created by government, which is why the Chinese government cannot violate the civil rights of the Uyghurs, but they can violate their natural rights. So, with this knowledge, let's go back to the beginning. The protesters who say healthcare is a human right, or marriage is a human right, or Miss Sultana saying education is a right. What kind of rights are they referring to here, do you think? Natural or civil? Well, on the face of it, it can't be natural rights. Think back to Crusoe's island. You don't have a natural right to healthcare or marriage or education, as these are things that can't be provided to you by your own labor, unless you're a doctor or something. But for most of us, if we were stranded on an island, we would not have the right to compel the universe to materialize a doctor out of thin air and cure us. So the statement, healthcare is a natural right, or education is a natural right, is false. Okay, since these statements can't be referring to natural rights, what about civil rights? Well, the China Uyghur example seems to show that it can't consistently be civil rights either. The statement, healthcare is a civil right, is false in the United States. The government declares what civil rights are, and so far, it has decided healthcare is not one of them. I think it should be, by the way, but we're not talking about what I think is a good idea. We're talking about what is, and healthcare is not a civil right. Either way you slice it, these are false statements. Of course, the people who hold up these signs or say these slogans don't think they're saying something false. They're not liars. They believe what they're saying is true, even if it doesn't make any sense. So let's put ourselves in their shoes. What do they think they're saying? What is it that they believe is true about these statements? Well, at the start of the video, I guessed that when Miss Sultana said education is a right, what she meant was education should be a right. When those American protesters said healthcare is a right, what they meant was healthcare should be a right. And I did put forward the question, why don't they use should be instead of the way less accurate is? Well, there's a reason for that. There's this general feeling in the culture of Western liberal capitalist democratic countries that violating somebody's natural rights is a more fundamental violation than violating somebody's civil rights, since natural rights are themselves more fundamental, while civil rights are granted by government and can be changed. Don't get me wrong, violating somebody's civil rights is still very serious. Like, for example, not following due process law when it comes to a court case or something. But censoring someone unjustly, or stealing their property, or murdering them, or enslaving them, these are generally viewed by common people as more fundamental violations, because these are rights that don't come from the authority of the state. They should be protected by that authority, and they existed before the state did. This is why we can make the claim that China is violating the natural rights of the Uyghurs, and have a righteous indignation towards the Chinese government for doing so, even though the Chinese government has not granted the Uyghurs civil rights. It's because, conceptually, natural rights exist beyond the bounds of government. It's something that government can't change, only protect or violate, which is why they're inalienable. So, if these activists were to say healthcare or education or marriage should be a civil right, those might be true or false statements, depending on your view of those policies. Maybe you'd vote for them, maybe you wouldn't, but they're still up for debate in the end. But a natural right, the thing you can do in a vacuum, that liberal governments have a duty to not infringe upon, those hold a different position in our culture. They're not voted on, they're not debated. Like, do you have the natural right to not be murdered in your sleep, is not the same type of question as, should education be a civil right? I think this is why the activists don't use should be, even though it would be more accurate, because the implication of should be means the topic is up for debate. And if it can be debated, they can lose that debate. But if you simply declare education is a right, there's an implication baked in there that education is part of that class of rights that are inviolable, and the use of is, in the context of that right not actually existing, is a declaration that it does exist, and it is being violated, not that it should exist, and government should grant it. It's a sleight of hand that makes civil rights appear to be natural rights, because the penalty of a liberal government violating a natural right is severe, while liberal governments are the ultimate arbiter of what civil rights are in the first place. I don't think this is malicious for most of these activists, by the way. I don't think they even know about this at all. But I do think that if you were to actually open up their mind and read their thoughts as they were thinking them, you'd basically get something like this. When these people make a strong statement about something that they like being a right, they're not necessarily asking the government to implement a policy. I mean, they are in a practical sense, but not in a philosophical one. What they're actually doing is shaming the government for violating their rights, even if the supposed violation makes no fucking sense at all. Like, you're not having your natural rights violated because you have to pay for your education, lady. But they oscillate between these two superpositions like a quantum particle, because on the one hand, it's convenient to believe that all human rights come from the government, since the idea of natural rights kind of implies the existence of God, and the relevance of religion in modern political theory, which progressives are kind of uncomfortable with, while on the other hand, wanting to use the extra moral shaming attached to a government violating a natural right that simply doesn't exist with violating a civil one. So, for people like Miss Sultana, the government is both the creator and the violator of this nebulous notion of rights, a word whose definition basically boils down to a series of things that the speaker thinks is a good idea to have, and so you're morally obligated to provide them, and if you don't, you're oppressing them. Next time you see somebody just mindlessly throw around the declaration that something, anything, is a human right, think it through. Maybe ask them a question like, why is it a human right? I bet the answer you get will basically be, it's good and I want it, which is an argument for making it a civil right. However, they'll also treat you like a monster for even daring to ask the question, like you've just violated a natural right. Existing in the space between these two definitions grants them access to moral outrage simply for being disagreed with. Like, who even questions rights? What kind of person are you? While nonetheless paradoxically demanding that those rights be questioned and changed to their liking. And they won't even be able to see their own inconsistency. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more from me, well, me, Dave, and Naomi went to go see the Beetlejuice movie, the sequel to Beetlejuice. It's up over on the side channel, so click on the link on screen and give it a go. I will see you there. Have a good one. I love you.